Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us today for our webinar on dealing with difficult employees. I'm Katherine Brustowicz, and I'm joined by my esteemed colleague, David Gabor.
Hello, thank you for joining us today.
We're going to discuss best practices in counseling management and explain steps that employers can take to get to the bottom of various employee issues, as well as the employment law and HR concerns they bring with them. Our focus is on identifying prominent issues you may be faced with. We'll walk through several scenarios that happen frequently so that by the end of the webinar, you feel better equipped to deal with these tricky situations. David, can you please walk us through the agenda?
Sure, Catherine, thank you very much. As you see, we're going to talk about setting the stage, the different types of issues that come to the attention of HR, leadership, and in-house counsel. We'll talk about due diligence and steps that you can be taking. Then we're going to talk about discipline and separate and apart from discipline, performance improvement plans, risk mitigation. And for those of you who've been at other programs that Catherine and I have put on, we like to have a top 10 list. Now, during the course of the program today, Catherine is going to help you start to create checklists for different parts of the process. So have your pens or writing sticks ready and let's get cracking. Catherine, let's talk about setting the stage. It matters how you learn about the difficult employee. The source of the concern, to some extent, ordinarily dictates the steps needed to address the problem. In the notice for the program that you all received, we talked about Georgina, and she is a manager who was having problems with two employees on her team. Both of the employees have been disengaged from work recently. They have been easily distracted, they missed deadlines, they called out of work, they showed up late to meetings. Classic example of difficult employees. So she's come to you with her challenges. The question is this a difficult employee? What is the reason why the employee has become difficult? What are the steps that you can take in addressing the problems? So that's the manager coming to you. Does it matter if instead of it being the manager, the person who comes to you is a coworker? What if the complaint comes from a third party? Perhaps it's a customer or a client, and you know the adage, the customer is always right. Well, in this case, is the customer always right? Someone who comes to you who's got time and attendance or performance issues. What could be the reason behind the time and attendance challenges that this person presents? You know, is there something going on at work? Is there something going on outside of work? You know, does it matter if it's a complaint about harassment or bullying as opposed to a complaint about time and attendance or someone who's disengaged from work? You better believe it matters. And then lastly, there are the employee engagement and morale issues that often arise in the workplace. So Catherine, we're talking about due diligence now. Can you lead us into that part of the discussion?
Absolutely, and thank you for setting the stage so nicely, David. The first step, regardless of the exact problem raised with respect to a difficult employee, is to information gather. There are always two sides to a story, and it's incredibly important to understand what exactly the employee is doing that is unacceptable and why this might be the case. For example, does the employee have something going on due to illness and might need a reasonable accommodation to successfully perform the essential functions of their job? If the employer is aware that a reasonable accommodation is in play, they have a duty to engage in the interactive process, and it can be very costly to simply discipline or fire the employee if they're not performing the essential functions of their job, and an accommodation could have been provided. This is partly why it is vital not to act too quickly and discipline an employee before you have an understanding of the full story. So to that end, we recommend some of the following steps. The first one on the list here is to speak with managers and supervisors. This will help to determine what the problem behavior is. As David had outlined, it could be a myriad of different concerns. Is it missing deadlines? arriving to work late? Is it being rude to clients and colleagues? Maybe it's even more egregious than that, like stealing client funds or being under the influence while at work. There are so many employee problems that might be at issue, and the potential solution will vary. Another question to ask of managers and supervisors is, has the employee reported any concerns or sought any support from management? Next is speaking with employees. This can be another very helpful step to take when information gathering. However, management needs to tread lightly and make sure not to share any protected information or inadvertently pit employees against one another. The next bullet point is conducting an investigation. Depending upon the situation, an internal investigation may be in order. Before jumping to conclusions, it's a good idea to conduct some form of an investigation. David is going to discuss investigations in greater detail a bit later in our program. Next is determine the type of discipline, if any, that should be imposed. This is another step that we'll delve into in a few slides, but I wanted to mention this up front, that the determination of discipline should be done following the information gathering stage and the investigation. David, would you care to elaborate a bit further on more due diligence considerations?
Sure, Catherine, thank you very much. I touched on how an organization becomes aware of challenges that they have with an employee, and it's important to take a step back for a moment. And we've all heard about implicit bias, and we're going to touch on that a little bit during the course of the program. Implicit bias can rear its ugly head when thinking about where the report of a challenge comes from. Do you give it more weight or credibility if it comes from a client, a customer, a manager, as opposed to a coworker? Is it something that comes from a person has been with the company for 10 years, as opposed to a person who has only been with the company for a few months? Now, the different types of issues that can arise, for example, we've got here 4: poor performance, time and attendance, misbehavior, and violation of rules. And if someone reports that an employee has poor performance, it may be just that the employee is a lousy worker, or it could be caused by a lack of training, problems with a coworker, differentials in expectations between that employee and another person. So it's important that we don't simply assume that the report is correct, in that situation. Similarly, with time and attendance, the expectations that a supervisor has of the employee who's reported for being a difficult employee may be different than the expectations that the same supervisor has for another employee on the team. Or it could be that this is a person who is a really good worker, but has difficulty getting to work at 9 a.m. But if the employee can come in at 10 o'clock, the employee can be your rock star and just work an hour later every day. Is that something that's possible? Now, with those writing sticks you have, make a note that this might be a solution so this employee can work on time, but is this going to create a concern that other employees will also want to have an accommodation to start the day an hour later? Or perhaps this person may be better suited working remotely 3 days, 4 days, or every day, and that might be a solution. But when you think about the solution, don't look at it in a vacuum. Look at it, with the big picture, the macro image. Misbehavior: a person talks out, makes verbal statements, or harasses other people. Don't accept that the person is doing that simply because someone says it's so. You do need to do a due diligence on that individual and the person who reports it. But you also have to think about, was a person who's misbehaving, does the person accused of misbehaving need to be suspended while you do your due diligence and your investigation? And if the answer is yes, is that with or without pay? And then you've also got the question about violation of rules. The company should have rules in an employee handbook that outline the behaviors that are expected of employees. And does this alleged behavior fall under any one of your rules or multiple rules? And if so, should you be following those rules? Now, we talked a bit earlier about having a checklist. Katherine, have you a checklist you can share with people regarding the due diligence?
As a matter of fact, David, I do. So
Just
here,
folks, by the way, I knew she did, by the way, just so you know.
I think that's pretty evident, but thank you. A wonderful lead in. So as David had mentioned, this here is essentially a checklist of considerations to include when you're doing your due diligence. So the first one on the list here is performance reviews. And a careful review of past and more recent performance reviews will help to paint a picture of when the employee's performance started to dwindle. Did it perhaps coincide with a new supervisor? If so, it's possible that there may be some implicit bias at play. Is this a very recent development? Is it isolated? If so, the employee may have something going on at home that they're dealing with, and it's negatively impacting their work. Alternatively, maybe this employee has consistently been a low performer and simply is continuing to exhibit these troublesome behaviors. Next, you'll want to examine any prior complaints about the employee. So this bullet point speaks for itself. If there are multiple recent complaints about the employee, further investigation is definitely warranted. If there's a pattern of this behavior, discipline is likely to be warranted as well. Each complaint should be examined very carefully. Take a look at how others in the department are treated. This ties back into the unconscious or implicit bias as a concern of potential disparate treatment. Are younger employees treated preferentially to older ones by a particular manager? What about employees of different ethnic backgrounds or religious beliefs? What about single employees as compared to married employees with children? It's important for all employees to be treated similarly, regardless of their being a member of a protected class based on their age, their race, color, sexual orientation, religion, gender, national origin, or even disability. This ties back into ensuring that management is properly trained on the policies and that they adhere to the policies in a uniform manner. Consistency and uniformity decreases the risk of claims of disparate treatment. Has the employee in question complained? Now, knowing whether an employee has complained of harassment or discrimination, wage and hour violations, or other illegal activity is critical. If an employee has made a complaint and is subsequently fired, the employer is at risk of not only a wrongful termination claim, but also a claim of retaliation. The timing of employee discipline is very fact-specific, and it needs to be considered. The next question to ask is there a contract? If an employee is not just an at-will employee, but has an employment contract, that contract needs to be reviewed very carefully prior to contemplating discipline, up to and including termination. There may, for example, be terms in the agreement outlining what constitutes termination for cause or not for cause. Does the agreement create any rights, like an entitlement to severance? Are there any post-employment considerations or obligations? Is there an arbitration clause? Review that contract with care before proceeding. The last consideration on this first checklist is whether there are other legal issues or impediments in play. What laws apply? Is there state law or local law protections that the employee might have? Is the employee working remotely from a state that's different from the employer's physical location? State employment laws vary tremendously with respect to leave laws, eligibility for unemployment benefits, the payout of accrued but unused vacation time. The list goes on and on. So it's important to be aware of which laws apply to the employee in question before imposing any type of discipline. Now, speaking of discipline, discipline is next up on the list.
Thank you, Catherine. And you all knew before the program today that we were going to talk about discipline. And one of the things to consider is your goals when you create a discipline program or when you discipline an employee. What are you trying to get out of it? Are you trying to teach this employee how to work better, make it very clear that you expect more of the employee? Is your goal, paper trail? Do you want to document that you've had a verbal counseling, a written warning, and then termination of the employment? Do you want the paper trail in case there's any kind of an issue down the road and you want to document the process? Is your goal to send a message to the employee? Hey, we are not going to tolerate that behavior. And is that your goal so that the employee understands there are consequences? You think about a person driving down the street and the speed limit sign says it's 35 miles per hour. There's no one around. It's 7 o'clock in the morning. It's a clear day. The roads are clear. There's no one around, and you really want to go faster. You don't want to go 35. You'd love to go 50. What's holding you back? The fear of getting a ticket for speeding. If that's the only thing holding you back, maybe that same employee might be the person who says, you know what, I'm not going to do these sorts of things because I don't want to get in trouble. Is your goal making an example of the employee for others? If you have a person who's not performing up to snuff, who's late, who's not, meeting deadlines, who doesn't act as a team member, doesn't respond to emails or other forms of communication, and that person gets disciplined, you're sending a message to other employees that you're not going to tolerate that behavior. And that's important because sometimes when you work with a coworker who is an underperformer, and that person seems to be getting away with it, it's very frustrating when you're working hard and the other person isn't. And that creates some of the issues on the last bullet, which is morale and the employee engagement on the team. Another thing to think about with discipline is the Great Resignation. And for the life of me, I don't know why people called it the Great Resignation, because I don't think there's anything great about it. However, a lot of people left their jobs. And if your discipline program and protocol is believed or perceived to be too harsh, that could have an impact on turnover in your organization. So it's something to think about, where if you've got a program that's too harsh, people may get frustrated. Now, Catherine, you are the checklist guru today. Could you jump in, please?
Certainly, thank you. So here we have another checklist, and this is a checklist with respect to prior to disciplining an employee. So these are some of the steps that we really highly recommend that you go through before you do contemplate discipline. First on our list is know your own policies. If, for example, your policy outlines a progressive discipline policy, you need to follow that policy. Make sure that you're not only following your policies, but you're following them in a non-discriminatory manner. In other words, every employee should be held accountable for following policies. For example, if you have two employees who are both chronically late for work, it is impermissible to discipline one and not the other, because you again expose yourself to disparate treatment. Train on your policies. It's really hard to enforce policies if management is unaware of what those policies are. It's important to disseminate the policies and ensure full understanding of the policies and how to enforce them. The same goes for when policies are updated. All management level employees should be trained and retrained when policies are modified. Disparate impact. We've already talked quite a bit about disparate impact, but sometimes the disparate treatment is unintentional. So to that end, management should keep in mind that it's not okay to play favorites. If there's a policy and someone fails to follow it, there should be uniform repercussions. Now, I mentioned this point of prior complaints earlier in the webinar. Have there been prior complaints about the same type of poor behavior? That weighs more heavily towards discipline being warranted. And what if the employee themselves has made complaints of unfair treatment? It may not be wise to immediately discipline an employee who has recently complained. First of all, there may not be anything to truly discipline the employee over, and you may expose yourself to the risk of a retaliation claim if the complaint was made soon before the discipline or adverse employment action is taken. Next on the list is an evaluation of the extent of the employee's transgressions. I think that this bullet point speaks for itself. A first-time minor offense of a policy should not be treated in the same way that a repeat offender or an egregious violation of a rule or policy incident should be treated. Now think about what an employee side attorney will be looking for. I really like this tip because it's very helpful when you contemplate what opposing counsel would actually be considering. Look at the issue from the opposite perspective. An employee side attorney is likely to look into the adequacy of trainings on the policies. Are the policies being equally enforced? Has the employee made any prior complaints about wage and hour issues, like unpaid wages or maybe improper overtime pay? Or have they made complaints of discrimination or harassment? Has the person recently received a PIP? Or have they recently received a performance review? Have any complaints been made about the employee? If so, how are other employees who exhibit the same or similar behavior being treated? Looking at the issue through the lens of an employee side attorney can give you insight as to where your strengths and weaknesses lie. Next, we have to consider whether some form of an investigation is warranted. Should an investigation be done before disciplining? Yes. We'll discuss this more in a few slides, but to get you thinking about investigations, here are a few considerations. Remember how earlier I emphasized the importance of information gathering and how there's always two sides to a story? Go back to the source of the issue. Is this issue based on what a manager told you? Or should this be further investigated? If, for example, a complaint is made by a male employee about a female colleague, we cannot simply take the male at his word. We need to look to see what the other side of the story is before we act. People are complex, and management needs to pay attention to these complexities and put in the effort to investigate both sides of the story. David, would you please explain what a performance improvement plan is and how they can be helpful?
Sure, thank you, Catherine. Performance improvement plans, or PIPs, they're a tool that can be used by an organization to help steer a wayward employee back on track. The reason why we separated out the PIP from discipline is Catherine and I do not believe that a performance improvement plan should be a form of discipline. It's its own element. It should be viewed as a step taken to coach the employee, not to punish an employee. At the same time, it's a very serious process, and it should be defined in some form of a writing, and the writing should describe how the employee has fallen short on expectations, what the expectations are of the employee, what's going to happen over the next 30, 60, 90 days, or whatever the length of the PIP is, what's expected of the employee during that period of time, and what the employee can expect of leadership to support the employee during the performance improvement plan. The reason why we wrote down that PIPs are oftentimes misused is because sometimes people use the PIP as I said, mentioned before, a form of discipline. And if that's the case, in that organization, when people are put on a PIP, they're going to believe oftentimes that they're just being managed out of the job, as opposed to being given a fair opportunity to improve on their performance so they can continue to work for the organization. What are the benefits of the PIP? There are quite a large number. First and foremost, dependent upon the position the person's filling, if you've got a person who's got the potential to succeed in the job, and with an effective performance improvement plan, that person can succeed, that's a heck of a lot better than that person being managed out and you start from scratch with another person. Think about a couple of things. One, with every new employee, there's a learning curve. And the more sophisticated or advanced the position, the greater the length of that learning curve. So it could be a 3, 6, 9, even 12-month learning curve before you really are getting a bang for the buck for that employee. Second thing is, when you bring in someone from the outside to fill the position, you don't know what you're going to get. You might get somebody better, you might get someone with the same challenges, or you might get somebody worse. You may have trouble filling the position. You're going to have to pay potentially for a recruiter to help you fill the position, and that costs a lot of money. The other employees who work in that department may get frustrated that there's turnover. They have a new person they have to work with for a period of time. They're going to be holding down the fort without that person. It can become a very challenging time period in that organization. And then we've got potential risks. Well, if, for example, an employee has complained that the manager isn't treating the person fairly, and then the person is put on a performance improvement plan, and they've got to report back to that manager, who they already believe is treating them unfairly, and the check-in was that manager, coach was that manager, that becomes a potentially toxic environment, and you've got a very upset, frustrated employee who is not going to be very happy and is going to go to that lawyer that Katherine was talking about and saying, hey, they threw me on a PIP, and now I've got to report to that same person I've complained about. So that's one risk. Second risk is if the language in the PIP is not clear, and it says it's a 90-day PIP, and after 45 days, it's very clear that this person is still a problem. The person's not advancing. The person may be complaining about anyone and everything, and you want to let the person go. But the person says, hey, I got a PIP that says I'm here for 90 days. They may see that as a contract. So make it very clear in the PIP, it's not a contract. This is a goal over 90 days, but the person's still an employee at will. The other risk you have is that if word gets out that Jane is on a PIP or John is on a PIP, and other people know about the PIP, then the perception employees have of Jane or John may be terribly negative. So we've got to be careful about that. Katherine, I talk about risk. Can you talk more about risk mitigation, maybe?
Yes, absolutely. And thank you for going through the performance improvement plans. That was all very valuable information. So as David had alluded to, we're going to delve into some risk mitigation tips here. Now, the first one is the prolonged retention of a difficult employee. If someone's not performing up to snuff, and you keep them without disciplining them or terminating their employment, they can create a situation in which you end up being stuck with them. If that difficult employee makes a complaint, perhaps that they're being treated unfairly because of their gender or age, you can't turn around and then fire them for their poor performance, because that would be retaliatory. Put another way, it would seem as though the organization fired the employee for making a complaint, and that is retaliation and is illegal. So instead of firing them, you would have to investigate the complaint, hope that the paper trail that David discussed earlier is solid, and the eventual termination of that employee would be much delayed. This also causes a ripple effect of many other troublesome HR issues. One such issue David had touched upon, and that's the perception from other colleagues. You know, Jimmy might be tired of the substandard work by Matilda. So in his mind, why should he work hard if Matilda doesn't? Why should Martha waste her time responding to emails when Matilda never does? The take-home message here is that if people behave badly and you prolong their retention, there are negative repercussions. That leads me to avoiding difficult conversations. This is in part why we frequently see underperforming or poorly performing employees retained. For many managers and people in general, we tend to be conflict adverse and avoid having difficult conversations. Hopefully, now that you better understand some of the ramifications of avoiding these difficult conversations, they will become easier to have. There are ways of having these difficult conversations with employees in which nobody feels attacked. Simply point out the deficiencies, see if there are solutions, document every step of the way, and if the performance does not improve, the employee is on notice, so they see their eventual termination coming and they aren't blindsided. Now, the last point on our risk mitigation slide is consistency. I've said it before, and I'll be consistent in my emphasis. Consistently following workplace policies in a uniform manner, regardless of the involved employee, will help to mitigate the risk of claims later being filed against your organization. With those risk mitigation strategies in mind, David, can you please walk us through some best practices regarding investigations?
Sure. Thank you so much, Catherine. The first point is pretty transparent, and I think you all know it. Not every investigation is the same, but to some extent, I think every time that a person does make a complaint to HR, some form of an investigation should be done. And the scope of the investigation depends on the nature of what's been reported to human resources or to someone else in leadership or in-house counsel. And if it's a person's got a time and attendance issue, well, you want to take a look at the file, look at your records of when the employee has been late. How often has it happened? How late has the employee been? You may want to talk to the employee and find out why the employee has been late. What is the reason for it? And that is a form of an investigation. Compare that to a complaint of sexual harassment, where you're going to be interviewing, possibly as many as 20 people about what's been going on in the department. But one of the things that's very, very important is to not prejudge the matter. I used the term implicit bias earlier, and this is another time where it's very important not to be biased, for example, in favor of the manager who's reporting that the person on the team is underperforming. It may very well be that the manager has not been properly guiding this employee. The manager has not included the employee in meetings or given the employee the same tools others in the department have to succeed. So you don't want to prejudge the outcome of the investigation. You want to approach it with an open mind. And that's critical in these situations. Your goal in an investigation is to find out what's happened. Not what's reported to you, but what actually happened. Some other things to think about, and we don't have a lot of time to spend on investigations, but you may want to make some notes. Do you have HR conduct the investigation, or do you bring someone in from the outside? One of the considerations is, will your internal team be able to investigate and get at the truth without being influenced either by a conflict of interest, a relationship with one of the parties involved in the matter, whether it's the HR person's boss who is part of the issue, the person who complained or the person who's complained about. You know, does your HR person have the skills to do an investigation? You know, if any of the answers lead to you're better off working with someone from outside, then that's the best thing to do. Because again, you want to get at the truth. And importantly, when you're looking to get at the truth, one of the things that you may discover in your investigation is that this has opened the door, opened your eyes to other significant issues. For example, if a manager complains about an employee underperforming, and let's say the manager is 40 years old and the employee that complained of is 55, and you look into it and you determine that the manager is harder on the over 50 employees than he is on the people in their 30s and early 40s. You may have a situation where you just uncovered a manager who's creating huge risk that could lead to possible class litigation against the company. So what I'd like to do now is jump to the next slide of steps that can be taken. And the first one is to reassess qualifications for managers. And Katherine talked a bit before about communication and not wanting to have certain types of conversations. She put it difficult conversations. When a person is put into the position of being a manager, the person should be a manager because a person has a desire to effectively manage and lead teams. For example, you have a sales team, and on your sales team, you've got a situation where the person who had the most sales becomes the manager. Well, the person with the most sales may not want to be a manager or care about leading the team. So you want to make sure that you've got the person who really wants to be a leader in that role, and train the managers to have those difficult conversations and manage 12 months a year and work on that bridge between the HR folks and managers and between managers and their teams. Sometimes people look at HR as traffic cops, and the managers have to understand the wonderful resources and help and support HR can give. Same as people on the team need to have a better impression and perception of management and leadership. I write trust but verify, and that is you want to build an environment where people on the team feel like they can take others at their word. And it makes a very big difference. And the last point is, when you do need to let somebody go, and I know Katherine is going to be touching on this in a bit, think about the value of a release, because a release closes the door to any potential other litigation down the road. And with that, let's move forward, Katherine, and I think we're up to our top 10 list.
We are, yes. Thank you for that, David. That was very, very helpful. So we do have about 5 minutes left, give or take. And David had mentioned that we always like to conclude our webinars by going through a top 10 list. These are sort of the take-home messages that we hope you can retain after the webinar. So the first one here is leadership needs to know if an employee is difficult. This goes back to communication across the team. David was just discussing that on the last slide. You know, the sooner that a problem employee is on management's radar, the better for the organization. Again, retaining a poor performer can be toxic to the work environment. A difficult employee really does impact morale and employee engagement and unwanted turnover. Think back to the example of the lazy employee, Matilda. You know, if she isn't held to the same standards that are expected, other employees are unlikely to maintain their work ethics as well.
Thanks, Katherine. Number 3, figure out why the employee is quote unquote difficult. Is the employee difficult because the person is just a poor performer, a bad egg? Or is the person, quote unquote, difficult because the person is being bullied or harassed by somebody, or there's been unfair expectations of the employee? Take the time to find out why the person has become a problem. And then in terms of measures of discipline, I know Catherine touched on it earlier, and if it's a minor transgression and the employee has a clean record, you might want to give a verbal warning. But having a zero tolerance for any form of harassment is a problem, because that may dissuade people from reporting harassment to leadership. So I think that take some time to consider what's appropriate and then communicate that. So Catherine, back to the checklists.
Absolutely. So I do love my checklists. And this checklist here is a little bit different from the previous checklists that we've reviewed. This is a pre-termination checklist. So first, if you know that an employee is going to be terminated, plan ahead with a transition plan. Is an internal colleague going to take on the employee's workload, or are you working to hire someone new? Planning ahead helps to make this transition much more smooth. Next, you're going to want to coordinate with IT to ensure that on the day and time of the termination, the employee's access to all accounts is shut off. You'll want to check on any contractual obligations as well, such as non-competes, confidentiality agreements, or maybe non-solicitation agreements that the employee may be bound to even post-termination. It's good to look into this in advance and then have a copy of these policies to physically hand to the employee when they're terminated. This acts as a reminder of those obligations. Similarly, it's helpful to have a list of company property that the employee must return. Being terminated can be a stressful experience, and having a list of the specific items, such as keys, ID badges, data, laptops, anything that needs to be returned, that list can really help to ensure that the company truly does get back all of the property. You may have to arrange for that employee to return to the physical office space if they're working remotely. You also want to have a plan for the termination itself. Have a specific plan and do not wing it. Plan the timing and the location in advance. I suggest a neutral location, never the employee's office. The reason for that is if the employee takes the firing poorly and you need to remove yourself from the room, it's easier to do that from a conference room or neutral location. There's some debate regarding the timing, but typically the end of the day is an appropriate time to terminate an employee. Of course, if they're being terminated for something egregious, an immediate termination may be in order. Another important pre-termination consideration that David had mentioned is whether some form of severance in exchange for a release of claims is in order. The business needs to weigh the cost of defending a case against the cost of severance in exchange for a release. If you do decide that severance is appropriate, you should have the severance agreement drafted prior to having the termination discussion with the employee. The termination and post-termination considerations. Even if you've planned out the termination itself, be prepared for the unexpected. You never know how an employee is going to react. So I recommend the buddy system for the termination discussion. Not only is there safety in numbers, but your buddy is a witness to the process and can write a summary describing the conversation. It's important to document this process. The employee might later falsely claim a wrongful termination or exaggerate the reason given for their termination. Your witness should write a summary of what was actually discussed and keep a copy of that account in the employee's personnel file. It may become exonerating evidence later down the road. Equally as important to documentation is to state the reason for the termination to the employee briefly. It's only human to want to lessen the blow to the employee, but it's important not to give false reasons for the termination. For example, a manager might want to avoid conflict, so may thank the employee for their hard work and excellence during their time with the company. But if the employee is actually being fired for poor performance or a different reason, they can potentially use the untrue explanation from their manager having praised their excellence in their favor, and later bring a wrongful termination claim. So be brief and be truthful. You'll also want to think about what you'll tell the other employees after the termination. You don't want to be caught off guard when a colleague asks what happened to Matilda. Again, keep the explanation brief, something to the effect of Matilda's no longer working with us, and while we wish her all the best in her future endeavors, you can speak with your manager about her workflow and being transitioned to a new or lateral hire. Got just a few last considerations here. There are logistics that need to be addressed. At the termination, it's best practice to have the final paycheck ready to hand to the employee. And depending on the state, the employee may be entitled to be paid out their accrued but unused vacation time upon termination. You also want to explain to the employee that IT has disabled their access to the various systems. This way, they're not caught off guard when they go to check their work email and see they're blocked out. And then you also need to provide the appropriate COBRA notices, as well as a copy of the post-employment obligations that we discussed. Those were the confidentiality, non-compete, and non-solicitation agreements, and have the employee sign an acknowledgement of that receipt. Now, I could spend the entire 45 minutes of this webinar discussing the termination process alone, but we are running out of time here. And I did want to let you know that I'm more than happy to discuss this further with any of you after the webinar. If you have lingering questions, we're going to be sharing our contact information on the final slide. David, could you please talk to us briefly about the importance of proper documentation?
Sure, thanks, Catherine. One of the things you don't want is if a claim is made of wrongful termination or something like that, to walk into court and when the judge asks, what documentation do you have to demonstrate that Matilda, poor Matilda, was a poor performer? And yeah, Judge, you have my word. She was a terrible performer because you don't have anything. There is no paper trail. There is no record of performance. Instead, the performance evaluation says meets expectations. So you need to make it very clear to your managers, they've got to document whether it's a verbal counseling, a written warning, poor performance, time and attendance, whatever it is, they've got to document then and there, not when they get around to it, because they never will get around to it. Regarding employment policies, take a moment to think about, what we talked about today and whether your policies continue the goals you have for your people management and your discipline programs. Just make sure your policies are consistent, they're workable, they're user-friendly for your organization, the way your organization is structured today. Catherine, could you hit briefly on communications and consistency?
Absolutely. So communication between team members, leadership, and colleagues is imperative. It starts with clearly communicating expectations and workplace policies, and then it extends to how concerns about poor behavior are reported and further communicated. So don't underestimate the value of communication. And that brings me to our last top 10 list item, which is consistency. And again, consistently applying workplace policies and procedures, as well as investigations, helps to avoid disparate treatment and the accompanying claims. So thank you very much for joining us today. Our hope is that you are taking home some of the important lessons that we reviewed. And if you have any questions about the content that we discussed or similar employment law or HR related questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to either one of us by phone or by email. Our contact information is included right here.
Thank you, Catherine. Also, two things. One, if you want to copy the slides, you can email either one of us. I would be happy to forward the slides to you. Also, if there's any other topics you would like us to talk about in 2023, let us know. Make suggestions. We're happy to talk, for example, about investigations or terminations or other checklists or any other issues that have you up at night. We're happy to talk about them in future programs. Happy holidays.
Thank you.